The maps were wrong. That's not an opinion or an interpretation. It's a documented operational fact that the U.S. military acknowledged throughout the war in Vietnam. The topographic maps issued to platoon leaders and company commanders in the Central Highlands were based, in many cases, on French colonial surveys from the 1940s and early 1950s. They'd been updated with aerial photography where available, but the canopy in the highlands was so thick that the photographs couldn't capture the ground underneath. Ridgelines were estimated. Streams were drawn where they probably were, not where they'd been measured. Contour lines, the lines that tell a man on the ground how steep a slope is, how deep a valley goes, where one ridge ends and another begins, were frequently off by hundreds of meters. And when your position on the map doesn't match your position on the ground, everything that depends on knowing where you are, artillery support, air support, resupply, extraction, coordination with adjacent units, breaks down. A platoon leader with Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 8th Infantry, 4th Infantry Division, described a November 1968 patrol in the Central Highlands, where his company made a wrong turn at a ridgeline and marched for over an hour before anyone realized the mistake. Over an hour. That's a column of men moving through jungle, which in the highlands meant 200 to 300 meters an hour on a good day, walking deeper into terrain they hadn't reconned, hadn't planned for, and couldn't accurately report to battalion because their map coordinates no longer corresponded to anything they could see. By the time the error was caught, the company was in a valley it wasn't supposed to be in, with no certainty about what was on the other side of the next ridge. That incident didn't result in a catastrophe. They corrected, retraced, and got back on track. But the same kind of error, on a different day, with an enemy waiting in the valley instead of empty jungle, could have killed everyone involved. And that's what this story is about. Not one spectacular failure, but the quiet, systemic way that a piece of paper could put American soldiers in places where they didn't belong, where help couldn't find them, and where the enemy already knew the ground better than any map would ever show. Robert Graham was a squad leader and platoon sergeant with a rifle company in the 4th Infantry Division, serving in the Central Highlands from 1969 to 1970. He was later retired from the service due to wounds received in Vietnam. Graham wrote a detailed account of the problems he saw on the ground, and navigation was near the top of the list. The area of operations for the 4th Division ran roughly 85 by 140 miles, from the Cambodian and Laotian borders east to An Khe, and from Dak to south to Ban Ma Thuot. It was mountainous, heavily forested, cut by rivers and streams that changed course with the seasons, and home to NVA units that had been operating in those valleys for years. The enemy didn't need maps. They knew the trails, the water sources, the ridgelines, and the approach routes because they'd been walking them long enough to memorize them. The American infantryman had a map, and the map had problems. The standard topographic map issued in Vietnam was the 1 to 50,000 scale. 1 centimeter on the paper equaled 500 meters on the ground. These maps were produced by the Army Map Service, working from French surveys, aerial imagery, and whatever ground control could be established. In flat terrain, the Mekong Delta, the coastal plains, they were reasonably accurate. In the highlands, where the terrain was vertical, the vegetation was impenetrable, and the survey control points were decades old. They could be significantly wrong. A ridge that appeared on the map as running north-south might actually curve to the northwest. A stream shown crossing a valley at one point might have shifted a kilometer during the monsoons, and the vegetation itself, double and triple canopy jungle, created a floor so dark and so uniform that a man walking through it had almost no visual reference to confirm his position. He couldn't see the ridge he was on. He couldn't see the valley below. He could barely see the sun. This is where the decision chain starts, because the platoon leader doesn't know the map is wrong. He's been trained to trust it. He was taught land navigation at Fort Benning, or wherever he went through officer candidate school, and the maps he trained with in Georgia or North Carolina were accurate to within a few meters. When he arrives in Vietnam and receives his operational maps, he has no reason to believe they're fundamentally unreliable. He plots his route, identifies his checkpoints, establishes his rally points, coordinates his artillery fan, and steps off into the jungle believing he knows where he's going. His tools are simple: a lensatic compass, the map, a pace count, the number of steps he takes per 100 meters, calibrated during training on known distances, and terrain association, which is the skill of matching what you see around you with what the map says should be there. In open country, terrain association is reliable. You can see a hilltop, a river bend, a tree line, and compare it to the symbols on the map. In triple canopy jungle, terrain association is almost useless. You can't see the hilltop because the canopy blocks it. You can't see the river bend because the vegetation is too thick. You can barely tell whether you're going uphill or downhill because the slope may be so gradual under the root tangle that your body can't feel it. So you're left with the compass and the pace count. And if the map is wrong, the compass and the pace count will walk you precisely to the wrong place. The first sign that something is wrong is usually a terrain feature that doesn't match. He's expecting a creek crossing at a certain point. It's not there. Or it's there, but it's running the wrong direction. Or the ground is sloping left when the contour lines say it should slope right. These are small discrepancies, and the natural human response, especially under the pressure of a mission with a timeline, is to explain them away. Maybe the creek dried up. Maybe the slope just looks different under the canopy. Maybe he miscounted his paces. A good platoon leader will stop, recheck his compass bearing, consult the map again, and try to reconcile what he sees with what he's supposed to see. But reconciling the real with the wrong is an exercise that has no solution, and the longer he tries to make the terrain fit the map, the further he walks into a position that nobody at battalion can verify. Here's where it gets dangerous. The platoon leader is required to send regular position reports, lock stats, back to his company commander, who passes them to battalion. Those coordinates are used to clear artillery fire, deconflict with adjacent units, and track the platoon's progress. If the platoon leader's coordinates are based on a map that doesn't match the ground, his reported position is wrong. He thinks he's at grid reference one place. He's actually somewhere else, and the artillery that he might need to call in is being plotted based on coordinates that don't correspond to where he or the enemy actually are. Veterans who served as forward observers and mortar fire controllers in Vietnam describe this as one of the most persistent anxieties of their work. A fire controller with a New Zealand force operating in Phuoc Tuy province wrote about the physical dread he felt every time he called in a fire mission, waiting for that first round to land, hoping he hadn't made a mistake that would drop it on his own men. He noted that there were many instances where inaccurate position reports led to friendly artillery landing on the troops it was supposed to protect. The first round of any fire mission was required to land 1,000 meters from friendly positions as a safety buffer. But if the friendly position was wrong by 500 meters, that buffer could evaporate. The tightening works like this. The platoon has descended into a valley it can't positively identify. The platoon leader knows something is off, but he can't determine exactly what, because every tool he has for determining his position, map, compass, pace count, terrain association, is giving him conflicting information. He can't call for accurate artillery support because he can't give his own position with confidence. He can't coordinate with the company on his flank because neither of them may be where they think they are. And if the enemy is in the valley, if this valley is one of the dozens in the Central Highlands that the NVA used as base areas, staging grounds, or approach routes, then the platoon has walked into a space where the enemy knows the terrain, and the Americans are guessing. The NVA exploited this constantly. They positioned base camps in valleys that were difficult to map and harder to reach. They used terrain features, steep-sided draws, double ridgelines, stream junctions, as landmarks for their own navigation, which was based on years of ground experience rather than French-era surveys. When an American unit stumbled into one of these areas, the NVA often knew the Americans were lost before the Americans did. They could hear the column moving, see the disturbed vegetation, and predict the unit's path based on the terrain that was funneling them in a particular direction. The platoon leader, looking at his map, might believe he was approaching a navigable pass. The enemy, looking at the actual ground, knew it was a dead end. The after-action reports from the Central Highlands are full of references to this problem. Units reporting contact at coordinates that didn't match the terrain where the contact actually occurred. Extraction helicopters unable to locate platoons because the coordinates they'd been given corresponded to a different ridgeline. Medical evacuation delayed because the medevac pilot couldn't find the unit that was calling for help. Artillery fire missions adjusted and readjusted because the observer's position was off by enough to make the first rounds land in the wrong valley. Each one of these failures traces back to the same route, a map that showed a version of the ground that didn't exist. The Hamburger Hill Battle in 1969, Operation Apache Snow, is one of the better-known examples. Decades later, veterans of the 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry, who fought on that hill, worked with historians and returned to the site trying to pin down exactly where the fighting had taken place. They found that the after-action reports contained coordinates that didn't match the terrain. The maps used during the battle had inaccuracies that made it difficult, even with the reports in hand, to determine the correct locations. Mike Boccia, a platoon leader during the battle, spent years working to reconcile the official record with the physical ground, because the two didn't line up. That's what a bad map did. Not just in the moment, though the moment was dangerous enough, but in the record. The after-action report is written using the coordinates from the same inaccurate map. So the official history of the engagement inherits the error. Years later, when someone tries to understand what happened and where, they find that the record itself is built on a false grid. The map distorted the battle while it was happening, and then distorted the memory of the battle afterward. I think about that platoon leader with the 4th Division in November 1968. He marched for over an hour in the wrong direction because the ridgeline didn't tell him what the map said it would. An hour. In the Central Highlands, an hour of movement in the wrong direction could put you a kilometer or more from where you were supposed to be, in terrain that you hadn't scouted, with coordinates that your own artillery couldn't trust. And the thing that makes this different from a story about a mistake is that the platoon leader didn't make a mistake. He followed his training. He read his map. He took a compass bearing. He did everything right. The information was wrong. After they realized the error and corrected course, somebody would have pulled out that map and drawn on it. A pencil line showing where they actually went. An X where the ridge turned. A note in the margin. Wrong contour. Creek not here. Ridge breaks northwest. Every platoon leader who used a map in the Highlands long enough ended up with a personal version of it, hand-corrected based on what he'd actually seen. Those corrections were the real map. They were the ground truth that no survey team and no aerial photograph had captured, and they were passed along, sometimes formally, more often just handed from one officer to the next during a changeover, with a word of caution. Don't trust this section. The contour lines are wrong. The creek isn't where it shows. The Army knew about the problem. Lessons learned bulletins from 1967 and 1968 specifically mentioned the unreliability of maps in the Highlands and recommended techniques for improving position accuracy, including having units fire marking rounds to establish their own locations relative to known artillery positions. That's a workaround for a system that has failed. You fire a round, see where it lands, and triangulate backward to figure out where you must be. The fact that this was considered a necessary procedure tells you everything about the state of the maps. Somewhere in a box, or a filing cabinet, or a veteran's desk drawer, There's a 1 to 50,000 scale topographic map of the Central Highlands with pencil marks all over it. It shows a ridge that the printed version got wrong, and a valley that didn't appear where it was supposed to. The pencil marks are the corrections, made by a man who was standing on the ground with a compass in one hand and a map that lied to him in the other. Those marks are the truest record of what that terrain looked like, and they were made by someone who learned the hard way that the most dangerous piece of equipment he carried wasn't his rifle. It was the map he trusted.